Hello everybody, my name is Helmi Hess and I work at RARE. Today we're going to be talking about shelter building. This is a super fun activity that you can do in your backyard, but you can also do it in the forest or anywhere else that you might get stuck. We're going to be talking about what tools you should bring with you. One of the main ones is the tarp. Another one is some rope or twine, and then something to cut things with. So that can include scissors for your twine, but also a saw to change the size of any of the pieces of wood you might be using. This should always be kept in a protective sleeve so that nobody gets hurt. But I'll show you mine so that you can see what it looks like. Whenever you're using a saw, make sure that you're telling people that you're using a saw and make sure that the area around you is clear. That should include the entire space that you can reach to, plus an extra foot outside of that. You might be wondering, why would I build a shelter outside when I have a nice cozy house to live in? Well, there are all sorts of situations in which you might get caught outside. That could include getting lost on a hike, and maybe you can't find your parents and you need to stay put in one spot until they find you. It could mean you had a car malfunction and your parents actually get stuck with you, and you might be stuck outside in weather that you don't want to be in. There are a few major things that we need to build shelter from. That includes the heat or the cold. It includes wind, it includes rain or snow, and it includes predators. That might mean something as tiny as a mosquito or as big as a cougar or a black bear. Wherever it is that you might get stuck, it's important to use what's around you. So let's say you're stuck in a blizzard out in the snow. It's important to be able to use the snow to build yourself a structure. So for example, you could dig a hole deep into the snow so that if the wind is blowing, you're actually out of the wind by being underground. The snow is actually a better insulator than you might think. It's very important to stay in that shelter because obviously the wind chill is going to be freezing cold. You can build a fire inside your snow shelter to keep it warm inside. There are all sorts of examples of snow shelters to build, including an igloo or a quinzhee. But let's say that you're out in the forest. The forest is filled with amazing materials with which to build shelters, and you can build all sorts of different shapes and sizes of shelter when you're out in the forest. Picking the place for your shelter is very important. You want to make sure that you're close to a body of water if you're going to be there for a long period of time, but it's also important to look for dangerous things around you. This could include a river or a lake that might flood, so you don't want to be right on the banks of either of those bodies of water. You also don't want to be in any low ditches because that's somewhere that water is going to collect if it rains. You don't want to be anywhere that you spot any signs of danger, such as bear claw markings on trees, but you also want to look out for plants around you, such as these raspberry bushes. Ouch! When you're building your shelter, you might find something that already looks like a shelter. For example, a cave or a fallen down log. It's really quick and easy to build a shelter on a fallen down log because all you need is one other log, and you can actually tie your tarp over top of this to make a tent. If you can't find something that already looks like a shelter, you can build it from scratch. For example, with using 3 logs, you can actually build a tripod onto which you can lean other sticks, like so. You can also tie a tarp around this to keep the heat in and the wind out even better. A more complicated structure is this A-frame. An A-frame can be used to tie a tarp over top, but if you don't have a tarp with you, you can also lean more branches up against the side of your A-frame to give it more of a tent shape. If you weave branches through here and you make it dense enough, you can actually make your A-frame waterproof. There are some important skills that you can learn to help with building your shelters. If we are going to make an A-frame, like I showed you before, you can see at the top this makes a cross shape. So I'm going to teach you how to tie those 2 pieces of wood together very strongly. The first thing you need is a very long piece of twine. I usually do 2 whole arm lengths to make sure that I have enough to get through the whole lashing. The first step in tying a square lashing is to tie your twine onto one of your pieces of wood. This is just a simple knot. Once that's on nice and tight, you can start your lashing. A lashing is, for a square lashing, you go behind your one piece of wood and over top of the next. You never do a crisscrossing pattern, so it's always over, under, over, and under. So once you've done one full round, you can just trace the steps that you did the first time. So I will go under the back piece of wood and over top of the cross piece. Under the back piece of wood and over top of the cross piece. So as I'm doing this, I'm pulling it quite tight. These are called the lashings. We do this 3 times in a row. Once we've got that 3 times, so you can see the 3 pieces of string here, we pull it as tight as we can, and we do what's called the frapping. This is to make sure that your lashing is very tight, because otherwise it can slip and slide around. Frappings are done only around the strings. So I'm going in between my 2 pieces of wood and just tying around the strings. So I'm pulling that nice and tight, and we do this 3 times as well. If you need to see any of this lashing again, you can always rewind in your video to make sure that you learned it properly. So we've done 2 frappings so far, and this is the 3rd one. And you pull nice and tight. So there's my 3 frappings. Before I tie the final knot, I'm going to test how strong that is. See how the wood doesn't shift at all, or barely at all? We pull that nice and tight, and then we tie one final knot. What you can do to make it easier is to tie it to the first bit of string that you used, and if you don't have enough string at the end there, you can just tie it right back onto the stick. This is again just a simple knot. You can trim off the final piece of string if you like, but you can also leave that on in case you need to use it for anything else. Now we can see that this is a nice and strong lashing. Another very important skill for your shelter building is to know how to tie a tarp onto your shelter. So the first step is to make a corner of your tarp be kind of like a string. This is done just by crumpling the tarp and twisting it around. The next step is to hold it in a loop. So I always do this in my left hand because I'm right-handed. You can see the tarp is now in a loop shape. The next step is to take a piece of string, go in the loop from the back, wrap it around the left side, and then back up through your string loop. And then pull this tight. This is called a sheet knot. This will keep your tarp very strongly. Once you've got it pulled very tight, this will keep your tarp attached to your shelter wherever you decide to put it. We're ready to combine these 2 skills. You can see the square lashing up here at the top of the A-frames, and you can see the sheet knot or sheet bend down here to tie the tarp onto your shelter. You can tie the tarp onto your shelter using any knot you like, as long as it's nice and tight. Here at EcoCamp, we learn all sorts of other skills with lashing and shelter building that allows you to be as creative as you can be. When we're using things like knives and saws, it's important to have a parent or an adult around for safety. Check out some of the cool structures we've built at EcoCamp with our amazing EcoCamp instructors.
Hey MTV, welcome to our crib.
At the end, when you've built your shelter, whether that's for an emergency need or when you're at EcoCamp, we always take everything down. We want everything to be left exactly how we found it. That includes cutting apart all of the lashings and taking all the bits of string with you. You also don't want to leave any of the logs or sticks up in a vertical position because that can deter wildlife from using that habitat. We also want to make sure we're taking our tarps and making sure we're taking any garbage with us, whether that's in your backyard or in the forest. Thank you for joining us today for this nature activity video featuring shelter building. Join us at Rare EcoCamp to learn so much more about shelter building.